Las Vegas, August 1972. The Las Vegas Hilton was a glittering temple of show business that night. Air thick with cigar smoke, champagne bubbling in crystal glasses, women draped in sequins and men boasting cufflinks that flashed like small suns. Every seat was filled. They weren't here for just another show. They were here to see a living legend prove he was still the king. The lights dimmed. Trumpets blared. The roar of the crowd shook the chandeliers as Elvis appeared in his white, jewel-studded suit. For a heartbeat, the world was exactly as it should be, myth and man colliding under the spotlight. And then it happened. A siren, piercing, relentless. A fire alarm cutting through the music like a blade. The room shifted instantly. Laughter curdled into fear. Chairs scraped, glasses shattered. Voices rose into frantic shouts. Fire! Smoke! Panic moved faster than reason. Thousands of eyes snapped to the stage, searching for the only figure who could hold them together. Would Elvis run? Like any man. Would he freeze, caught between danger and duty? Or would he do the unthinkable? Sing louder than the fear itself? That night, one choice turned chaos into history. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The showroom of the Hilton in Las Vegas was already a furnace of anticipation that night. Bright chandeliers threw golden light across rows of polished tables, each dressed with white linen and crowded with glasses that caught the glare like restless jewels. Cigarette smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling fans, drifting in a haze that softened the edges of faces but sharpened the mood. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The crowd wasn't just another audience. It was a gathering of gamblers, magnates, women wrapped in fox fur and diamonds, reporters clutching notebooks, and tourists from small towns who had saved every spare dollar just to say they had seen Elvis Presley live. Every breath carried a charge of expectation, as though the air itself was trembling in the moments before the first chord. Behind the curtain, the scene was nothing like the glittering spectacle outside. The narrow corridors buzzed with voices, cables snaked across the floor, and the faint hum of amplifiers created a low background vibration. Members of the TCB band checked their instruments, cracking small jokes to hide their nerves. Charlie Hodge adjusted a microphone stand, muttering about its height. The brass section rehearsed a quick run, the trumpets barking like impatient dogs. There was movement everywhere, but beneath it lingered a current of unease no one wanted to acknowledge. Elvis stood slightly apart, leaning against the wall in his trademark jumpsuit, white with embroidered details that shimmered under the harsh backstage bulbs. His hair was perfectly set, yet one hand ran restlessly through it, a telltale sign of nerves. After more than a decade of commanding the world's largest stages, the king still carried a strange mixture of confidence and vulnerability. That night he felt a heaviness he couldn't shake. Perhaps it was the presence of so many reporters waiting to pounce on a stumble. Perhaps the burden of knowing his every move would be recorded, dissected, and printed by morning. He straightened his collar as though adjusting armor. Joe Esposito, ever loyal, clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Crowd's packed tight, E. Place is buzzing. You're gonna knock 'em flat." Elvis gave a half smile, appreciative but distracted. He had walked into countless shows before. But tonight there was a pulse he couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear. He rarely felt fear on stage. It was more like a storm pressing down on the horizon, invisible but undeniable. One of the musicians, crouched near an amp, wrinkled his nose. "Do you smell that?" he whispered to another. It was faint, a trace of something metallic, burnt. Maybe dust on the wires, maybe nothing. He glanced toward Elvis but said nothing. The last thing he wanted was to break concentration moments before curtain. Better to let it pass, he thought. Out in the hall, ushers in red jackets guided the last latecomers to their seats. The chatter swelled, merging into a restless hum. At the central tables, men in tailored suits whispered to one another, their cufflinks flashing under the lights. Among them sat casino owners with shark-like grins. ready to see if the show would drive business back to their floors. Near the edge of the room, two officers from the Las Vegas Fire Department occupied reserved seats, their uniforms crisp, their expressions coolly observant. They had been invited as a courtesy, but their presence gave the evening a strange gravity, as if unseen eyes were judging every risk. At another table, a cluster of journalists sat armed with pens, their faces already sharpened into questions. They weren't there simply to be entertained. They wanted a story. The announcer's voice boomed across the room, and the lights dimmed to a focused glow on the velvet curtain. A cheer rose from the crowd, followed by a wave of applause that rattled the glasses on the tables. In that instant, Elvis closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and summoned the stillness that always came before stepping into the spotlight. He had felt exhaustion earlier in the dressing room, a weariness of body from endless nights and rehearsals. But the moment the first chord hit, he knew it would vanish. That was the rhythm of his life. Fatigue drowned beneath adrenaline. Yet even as he prepared to step forward, the unease persisted. Something about the atmosphere seemed tighter than usual, as though the audience itself was holding its breath too long. The muffled clang of plates in the kitchen sounded sharper. The rustle of the curtain seemed louder. He turned his head slightly and saw Red West adjusting his stance, scanning the room with the practiced eyes of a guard. Elvis caught his gaze. Red's expression said everything without words. "Stay sharp tonight." The signal came. The band launched into the opening bars, a bright, brassy surge that electrified the hall. The curtain lifted, and the roar of the crowd rose like a tidal wave. People leapt to their feet, women clutching their purses to their chests as if to hold their hearts in place. Men whistling and pounding their palms together until knuckles stung. Elvis strode into the light, hips already in motion, guitar hanging against his side. The familiar ritual should have steadied him, but somewhere behind the cheers he caught the faintest sound, like the groan of machinery, or perhaps just imagination. He tilted the microphone toward his mouth, eyes scanning the sea of faces, every one of them reaching toward him with desperate joy. The king had arrived, and yet, deep inside, he knew this night carried more than another set of songs. There was weight in the air, the kind that bends moments into memory. And in that silence between the opening cheer and his first lyric, he felt it, the silence before the storm. The show had just hit its stride. Elvis leaned forward into the spotlight, his voice carrying over the brass with the kind of force that could shake loose the last bit of doubt in any soul. The rhythm was building, the audience clapping in uneven bursts, some swaying, others watching in awe. The night felt electric, dangerous almost, alive in the way only Vegas could be. Then it happened. A shrill, mechanical wail sliced through the music. At first it blended oddly with the high pitch of the trumpets, a note out of place but not immediately recognizable. But as it grew louder, stretching into an insistent drone, the band faltered. The guitarist's hand froze mid-strum. The drummer's sticks hovered in the air. And then came the realization. It wasn't music. It was the fire alarm. The siren tore into the hall with merciless repetition, bouncing off the walls until it felt as though the entire room vibrated. For a beat, the crowd thought it might be some new theatrical trick, part of the show, an experimental flourish. But confusion gave way to shouts. A woman in the second row stood so abruptly her chair clattered backward. Somewhere near the rear doors, a man's voice cut through. Fire! That single word, unverified, unseen, did more damage than the alarm itself. Heads turned sharply. People rose, some clinging to purses, others grabbing jackets from the backs of their chairs. The swell of panic spread like spilled water on polished wood, impossible to contain once it started moving. Glasses tipped, liquor sloshed. Chairs scraped across the carpet as the first bodies surged toward the aisles. Elvis froze at the center of the stage, microphone still in hand, his band stranded behind him in a half-finished chord. The siren drowned out every thought, its pulse carving into the nerves of everyone present. He watched as the front rows, wealthy men with jeweled cufflinks, women draped in mink, looked frantically over their shoulders, weighing whether to flee. Reporters halfway down the hall were already scribbling, pens darting across paper, some of them shouting half-coherent observations into pocket recorders. The uniformed fire officers rose from their seats, eyes sharp, assessing the chaos. But even their presence couldn't cut through the panic that had taken hold. One table away, a man in a beige suit knocked over his whiskey glass as he lurched to his feet. "Get out! Smoke in the back!" he cried, though no one could see a trace of it. That was enough. More voices joined, and the crowd became a tide, some pushing toward the doors, others paralyzed by indecision. Elvis lifted his free hand, palm outward, signaling his band to stop completely. Silence from the instruments left only the siren and the chaos of the crowd. He stepped forward, squarely into the beam of the spotlight, the glare almost blinding, but he needed it. His chest rose, steady despite the hammering inside. He had seen fear in others before, in studios, on tour buses, in lonely dressing rooms, but never at this scale, never with so many people looking for direction at once. He held his stance for a long moment, letting the weight of his stillness speak louder than the alarm. Then, in a voice that cut clean through the siren, deep and resonant, he addressed them. The exact words would later be disputed in newspapers, misquoted, embellished, but everyone agreed on one thing. The way he spoke forced people to stop moving. The effect was almost supernatural. Hundreds of heads turned toward him as though pulled by a single string. The scramble slowed. The woman who had stood first lowered her hands, though her chest still heaved with fright. Even the man who had cried, "Fire," faltered, shrinking back into his seat, as though ashamed to be singled out by the gaze of the king. In the blur of smoke-stained memories of that night, one detail remains vivid: the contrast. On stage stood Elvis Presley, immovable, framed in light, his jumpsuit catching every shimmer. In the hall, chaos still lingered. Tables overturned, drinks spilled, a child clutching at his mother's skirt, a casino executive clutching his chest in alarm. But slowly, the roar of panic softened to a murmur. The alarm continued, relentless, a reminder of danger whether real or imagined. Yet against it, his presence had become the anchor. He hadn't sung a note, hadn't played a chord, but his refusal to yield pulled the focus of the entire room back to him. People who moments earlier had been ready to trample one another now stood, waiting, held by something stronger than fear. The reporters scribbled faster than ever, eyes flicking between the stage and the crowd, realizing they were watching a story no one had anticipated. The fire officers exchanged glances, one gesturing toward the ceiling as though to say, "We don't see smoke." Still, the uncertainty remained, sharp as the siren's cry. And Elvis, still silent, still steady, let the pause stretch longer than anyone thought possible. His jaw set, his gaze unwavering, he embodied the one thing the room desperately lacked: control. The next moment would decide everything, whether the evening would collapse into disaster or become a night remembered long after the echoes of the alarm had faded. The alarm screamed without mercy, filling every corner of the showroom. It should have shattered the moment beyond repair. Yet Elvis did not move from the center of the stage. He let the piercing tone hang in the air a little longer, until the nervous murmurs reached their peak. Then, with a calmness that seemed impossible amid the chaos, he lowered the microphone toward his lips. "Now, if this is the end of us," he said, pausing just long enough for the crowd to catch its breath, "at least let it be with a song." The words carried not only humor, but authority, a subtle reminder that he was still in charge. Nervous laughter flickered through the room, fragile, uncertain, but enough to break the sharpest edge of panic. A man in the front row lowered his hands from his face. Someone near the back muttered, "He's not running." Slowly, a few people sank back into their seats, unwilling yet to abandon the show. The band looked at him for instruction, their instruments hanging in silence. One of the managers rushed onto the edge of the stage, whispering harshly into Elvis's ear. "We've got to stop! Insurance, liability, it's too dangerous!" Elvis tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but dismissal. His eyes stayed fixed on the crowd, never wavering. "If I stop now," he said clearly enough for those near the front to hear, "fear wins, and I don't sing for fear." With a quick hand gesture, he signaled the musicians back into readiness. The drummer lifted his sticks, uncertain. Elvis gave a slight nod. And the unmistakable opening of Suspicious Minds burst forth. The choice wasn't casual. The irony was deliberate. A song about doubt, distrust, and the strain of suspicion suddenly became a mirror for the hall itself. The audience, still trembling from the alarm, heard the words in a way they never had before. Each lyric pressed against the air, already thick with uncertainty. Elvis leaned into the first verse with power, his voice cutting through the siren like a blade through fabric. The alarm continued to wail overhead, but he sang over it, louder, stronger, filling the room with a force that turned the shriek of machinery into mere background noise. The crowd, at first bewildered, began to shift. People who had been halfway to the doors paused, torn between instinct and awe. The repetition of the chorus, "We can't go on together with suspicious minds," landed with eerie precision. As though on cue, some in the audience began to sing with him, their voices hesitant but growing. The siren could not match the human swell of sound. It grated, yes, but Elvis's voice demanded loyalty, demanded attention. Even the children, frightened moments earlier, turned wide-eyed toward the stage. Women gripped their partners' arms, not in fear now, but in solidarity with the man who refused to bend. Behind the curtain, chaos still ruled. Staff members argued about whether to cut the power, whether to evacuate. Casino executives barked orders, terrified of lawsuits. But none of it mattered to the man under the spotlight. Elvis had locked himself to the moment, forcing thousands of people to remain with him. As the song drove into its bridge, he pushed harder, sweat glistening along his temple. His voice grew raw, charged with something more than performance. It wasn't showmanship anymore. It was command. And it worked. The nervous shuffle of feet quieted. The cries of fire dissolved into silence. All that remained was the clash between the alarm and his voice. And, for the first time, the alarm seemed weaker. The journalists scribbled furiously, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They had come expecting glamour or maybe a stumble to exploit. Instead, they watched a man wrestle a panicked crowd back from the brink with nothing more than his will and his music. When he reached the final chorus, something remarkable happened. Entire rows of the audience, their fear still hovering just beneath the surface, sang with him. Not every voice was steady, but together they rose, drowning out even the alarm for a moment. The showroom had transformed, panic into unity, chaos into communion. The last note hung in the smoky air, Elvis holding it until his chest heaved. He lowered the microphone slowly, eyes sweeping across the room. People were standing now, not in flight, but in ovation. The applause cracked like thunder, clapping hands desperate to confirm they were still alive, still together. The alarm had not stopped, but it no longer owned the room. He did. The applause still shook the walls when the first coughs came from the back rows. At first they blended into the roar of clapping hands, barely noticed. But as the ovation softened, the sound of hacking throats carried forward, sharp and unsettling. Heads turned. A man dabbed his mouth with a handkerchief, his shoulders shuddering. A woman 2 tables away fanned her face, insisting she smelled something acrid. The word smoke spread in whispers, more dangerous than a shout. Elvis, still at center stage, caught the shift immediately. He knew how crowds moved, how moods rippled from one corner of a room to another. This ripple was darker than applause. It threatened to unravel the calm he had just built. The alarm still howled overhead, relentless. feeding suspicion. Reporters pounced on the moment, pens scratching, some of them even standing to crane their necks toward the back of the hall, eager to confirm a story of disaster. One photographer hoisted his camera high, hoping to catch the image of chaos, eyes wide, hands pointing toward shadows that weren't there. The audience's confidence began to fracture again. A man muttered, "I smell it too," though he wasn't sure. Someone else swore the curtains near the exit flickered with a gray haze. Paranoia moved faster than fact. People shifted uneasily in their seats, weighing once more whether to bolt for the doors. Elvis narrowed his gaze. He sang the last lingering notes of Suspicious Minds, then let the microphone fall to his side. His chest heaved, his jumpsuit damp with sweat, but his stance radiated control. He signaled quickly with 2 fingers toward the wings. Red West, his longtime friend and bodyguard, understood immediately. Without hesitation, Red disappeared behind the curtains, his heavy frame moving with purpose toward the source of the supposed danger. The decision was instinctual, almost military. Elvis would not abandon the stage, but he would not ignore the unease either. He trusted Red, trusted him to walk into the unknown so that the crowd didn't have to. Meanwhile, the audience murmured louder. The sight of Red moving swiftly only fueled speculation. Some convinced themselves it confirmed the worst. Why else would a guard rush backstage unless the building was in danger? A ripple of fear crested again, visible in the way bodies leaned forward, as though ready to spring. Elvis raised the microphone slowly, his eyes scanning the restless sea of faces. The spotlight caught the shine in his hair, the sparkle of his outfit. But what truly silenced people was his voice, low, steady, and absolute. "Friends," he said, "if there's smoke, we'll know it soon enough. But right now, all I see are eyes looking for someone to tell them what's real." The phrasing was careful, deliberate. He wasn't denying their fear. He was reframing it. For a moment, the whispering dulled. In the shadows of the rear, a child clung to his mother's arm. She stroked his head, whispering reassurance she didn't feel herself. Near the center, a casino owner, his tie loosened, whispered to the fire officials at his table. One of them shook his head slightly, as though to say, "We don't see fire yet." Yet. That word clung like a hook in the crowd's imagination. The alarm never paused. Its wail had become almost unbearable, each pulse striking like a hammer. Combined with the smell, real or imagined, it painted the room with unease. Behind the curtain, Red moved through narrow passageways, checking corners, sniffing the air. He pressed his palm against the door to the service corridor. Cool, no heat, no visible smoke. He squinted at the control panel on the wall. The alarm switch had been pulled, not triggered by heat or flame. Someone had touched it. Whether prank, sabotage, or warning, he couldn't yet know. Back in the hall, Elvis's patience was wearing thin. He tilted his head toward the band. "Play it low," he murmured. The guitarist strummed soft chords, filling the space with something human against the mechanical screech. Some in the audience closed their eyes, letting the gentle rhythm steady them. Others kept looking around, unable to shake the doubt. The journalists scribbled with renewed fervor, half of them preparing stories of chaos, the other half unsure whether they were watching the birth of legend. Elvis shifted closer to the edge of the stage, as though to collapse the distance between himself and the crowd. "You've trusted me with your nights, your laughter, your tears," he said, his words booming over the alarm. "Trust me now. If there's danger, we'll face it together. But don't let shadows decide for you." His voice pressed into their bones. A woman in a sequined gown lowered her hands from her mouth. A man near the back shook his head, as if waking from a spell of panic. Slowly, the tide of suspicion ebbed again. Still, the uncertainty hovered. The smoke was invisible, but was it absent or merely unseen? That question lingered in every breath. Every sideways glance, every cough that echoed in the hall. And behind the curtain, Red West approached with answers that would decide whether Elvis's gamble had saved the night or only delayed the inevitable. Red West moved quickly through the narrow service corridors, his boots striking against the concrete with a hollow thud. The sound of the alarm grew harsher here, echoing in the confined space, each pulse rattling his chest. He scanned the dim passageways, bare bulbs swinging overhead, the faint scent of dust and old wood thick in the air. No smoke, no flicker of flame, just the metallic tang of nerves and machinery. He reached the fire control panel and crouched. The switch had been pulled. Not by heat, not by smoke sensors, by hand. Someone had triggered the alarm deliberately. Red's jaw clenched. This wasn't an accident of faulty wiring. It was sabotage. He turned sharply, retracing his steps. On his way back toward the stage entrance, he passed two stagehands arguing in hushed tones. "I swear I saw a guy in a gray jacket near the panel," one muttered. The other shrugged nervously, avoiding eye contact. Red didn't stop. There was no time. Elvis needed an answer. Meanwhile, in the showroom, the tension was climbing again. A uniformed fire officer had risen from his table, his voice cutting through the uneasy murmur. "This show should be stopped immediately. Safety regulations demand evacuation until the system is cleared." His words rang with authority, and for a moment, the balance tipped back toward panic. Guests shifted in their seats, glancing at the exits. The casino executives whispered fiercely, calculating liability in every second of delay. On stage, Elvis caught the officer's words. His jaw set. He could see the ripple of fear tighten once again, undoing the fragile calm he had built. For a moment he said nothing, his silence louder than the alarm. Then, with a deliberate gesture, he extended his arm and beckoned the fire officials toward him. "Gentlemen," he said into the microphone, his voice even, commanding, "if there's a danger here, let's not whisper about it. Let's stand here together and tell these people the truth." The crowd hushed, stunned by the boldness of the invitation. The firemen exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected to be called into the spotlight, to bear public witness, but Elvis's authority left no room for refusal. Slowly, hesitantly, they walked to the stage. Their boots thudded against the stairs, uniforms sharp under the blaze of the lights. Elvis stepped back, giving them space beside him. He held the microphone toward the officer who had spoken. The man cleared his throat, glancing out at hundreds of eyes staring up at him, his face flushed with the weight of responsibility. "At this time," he said reluctantly, "we see no active fire. The alarm was triggered, but we've observed no visible smoke or flames." The words rippled through the audience. Shoulders sagged in relief. A woman pressed her hands together as though in prayer. A man chuckled nervously, as if embarrassed by how close he had come to fleeing. The panic loosened its grip, but not entirely. The alarm still blared overhead, refusing to release the room. Elvis took the microphone back. "You heard it, folks," he said, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "No fire." He paused, then added with a sly smile, "And if there is one, I say we burn together, with music." Laughter broke out. Genuine this time, not nervous. The joke cracked the tension, turning fear into something almost absurd. Even the reporters, pens frozen mid-scribble, couldn't help but grin. They knew they were watching something unprecedented. Red West reappeared from the wings, moving briskly. He leaned toward Elvis, speaking low enough that only he could hear. "Pulled by hand. Someone wanted this." Elvis nodded, his eyes narrowing. He didn't reveal the revelation to the audience. Not yet. They didn't need sabotage. They needed steadiness. Instead, he turned back to the crowd, his hand resting lightly on the microphone stand. "We came here tonight to sing, not to scatter. And I promise you, until this voice gives out, the music will not stop." The band caught his signal. Instruments stirred again, this time softer. a tentative melody rising beneath the siren. Elvis let it build, his stance firm, as though daring the alarm to outlast him. The fire officials, awkward in their role, retreated back to their seats, their authority undercut by his calm command. The casino managers whispered furiously, but they too could feel the shift. The audience was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to him. For the next few minutes, the room hovered in a fragile balance. Fear still present, but wrapped now in the strange, unshakable certainty of a man who refused to leave. Elvis had forced the crisis into the open, and by dragging the supposed authority onto his stage, he had turned doubt into proof. The alarm screamed on, but the people were listening to him, not it. The words of the fire officials had steadied the room for a moment, but in the wings, the casino administrators were unraveling. Suits crowded together, voices sharp, their eyes darting toward the stage with a mixture of fear and fury. The alarm's shriek made every discussion harsher, every gesture frantic. They weren't thinking of the music or the crowd. They were thinking of liability, of headlines, of insurance clauses written in black ink. One manager, red-faced and sweating, leaned into Joe Esposito's ear. "Get him off right now. If this goes south, we're finished," another shouted over the noise. "He's risking everything, the Hilton, the whole operation. Do you understand what kind of lawsuits?" Their panic was a different breed from the audience's. Not the fear of fire, but the fear of financial ruin. Joe tried to calm them, but they surged forward. A man in a dark jacket darted toward the curtain, preparing to signal the band to stop. Red West blocked him with a single step, his shoulders filling the narrow passage. "He's not leaving," Red growled. "Not unless he says so." On stage, Elvis seemed to sense the pressure from behind him, as if he could feel the weight of their arguments clawing at his back. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the cluster of administrators at the curtain. His gaze was steady, defiant. He knew what they wanted, and he knew he would not give it to them. The alarm wailed on, unrelenting. The crowd, though calmer, was still caught in a fragile balance. A single wrong move, an order to evacuate, a rush to the exits, would shatter it again. Elvis raised the microphone, his voice dropping into a quiet intensity that cut through the mechanical howl. "They want me to stop," he said, his eyes locked on the audience. "They want me to walk away and leave you with this noise in your ears, this fear in your chest. But if I do that, then fear wins, and I don't live by fear." The words rippled across the hall, a direct challenge to the faceless suits in the shadows. He lifted his hands, gesturing for silence from the band. The instruments fell away. For the first time that night, only his voice remained against the siren. He closed his eyes, inhaled, and began to sing. No guitar, no brass, no drums. Pure voice, raw and unaccompanied. The sound carried through the hall with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. The siren fought to dominate, but his tone cut through it like a blade through cloth. The first rows froze, entranced. A woman in a sequined dress pressed her hands to her chest, tears shining in her eyes. A man who had been whispering nervously stopped mid-sentence, caught in the gravity of the moment. Even the journalists lowered their pens for a heartbeat, stunned by the audacity of a singer who dared to confront danger with nothing but his voice. The silence of instruments transformed the hall. Thousands of people held their breath, listening, not to safety instructions, not to officials, not to fear, but to one man's refusal to yield. The alarm shrieked, but it seemed smaller now, reduced to a background drone. The melody came alive in its simplicity, every syllable laden with defiance. Behind the curtain, the casino executives fumed. "He'll kill us all," one muttered. But even they could feel it, the shift in the room. The audience was no longer panicked. They were spellbound. They weren't thinking about lawsuits or exits. They were locked on the figure in white under the spotlight, a man who stood unbroken against the siren. The song stretched longer than usual, every note pulled to its limit. Elvis's voice cracked once, raw from the effort, but it only made the moment stronger. It wasn't polish they wanted. It was truth. And in his unaccompanied singing, truth bled into every corner of the hall. By the time he reached the final line, the audience was silent. No one moved, no one coughed, no one whispered. The siren still screamed, but it no longer mattered. For a few impossible minutes, Elvis had bent time and sound, forcing thousands of people into unity with nothing but breath and will. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. He lowered the microphone, sweat glistening down his temples, his chest rising and falling. The crowd erupted, not in panic, but in applause, a storm of clapping hands and shouts of devotion. The administrators at the curtain dropped their arguments. They understood finally that the man on stage wasn't just a performer. He was something they couldn't control with contracts or orders. He had turned against their rules, and in doing so, he had won the night. The alarm had not stopped, but fear had. The applause thundered through the Hilton showroom, but it couldn't drown the siren. Its relentless wail pierced every hand clap, every cheer, reminding all that uncertainty still hung in the air. The audience stood between awe and anxiety, suspended on a knife's edge. Elvis had pulled them back from panic twice already, but tension has a way of returning, creeping in through the smallest cracks. It was a journalist who struck the crack wide open. He was seated near the middle, his notebook already filled with frantic scrawls. Hungry for a headline bigger than Elvis kept singing, he rose to his feet, his voice sharp and theatrical. "There's danger in this building. Get out while you can." The words ripped through the room like a blade. Heads whipped around. Fear reignited in an instant. A woman clutched her child tighter. A man half stood, ready to run. The crowd's fragile unity teetered again, threatened by one man's bid for sensationalism. Elvis's eyes snapped toward the source of the voice. He knew him, reporter from Los Angeles, a face he'd seen backstage in earlier tours, always fishing for scandal. Elvis's expression hardened. He stepped forward, microphone in hand, his frame commanding the spotlight as if it were a weapon. "Sit down, John," Elvis said, his voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut steel. The use of the man's name was deliberate, intimate, impossible to ignore. The hall froze. Every eye shifted to the reporter, caught like prey in a trap. John hesitated, his bluster faltering. Then, under the weight of hundreds of stares, he slumped back into his seat, his pen trembling in his hand. The silence that followed was electric. Elvis held the microphone steady, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. His tone deepened, steady as stone. "You came here tonight for music, not madness. Fear feeds on whispers, on men who shout without knowing. But trust is louder than all of this." He gestured toward the shrieking alarm, his voice rising above it. "If you've ever trusted me, on record, on stage, in your hearts, trust me now. Stay with me. Don't run. Don't give in." The plea was not a command, but an offering. It reached past the noise, past the panic, straight into the marrow of the audience. In the front row, a woman wiped tears from her cheeks, nodding silently. A man in a worn jacket pressed his palms together as though in prayer. Even the restless children stilled, their wide eyes fixed on the figure in white, who stood unshaken. The psychological shift was almost visible, a wave sweeping the room. Panic loosened its grip. Shoulders dropped. Breathing steadied. The alarm continued, but its power waned, outmatched by the unity taking root among strangers. Elvis did not let the moment pass. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, leaning toward the crowd as though collapsing the space between himself and every soul in the hall. His voice dropped into intimacy, each word carrying like a whisper, amplified by faith. "Don't let one man's fear become your own. Don't let shadows lead you out that door. Tonight, we're together. And together, Nothing breaks us. The hall was silent now, except for the siren. The crowd hung on his words as if they were the only solid ground in a shifting world. A child's voice suddenly pierced the silence. "Sing, Elvis!" It came from the back, innocent and unplanned. Laughter rippled, not mocking but relieved. The tension cracked like brittle glass. Elvis smiled, his eyes softening, and nodded toward the unseen child. "All right," he said. "We'll sing." The audience erupted in applause, this time not frantic but certain, deliberate, a collective agreement to stay. Journalists scribbled furiously, knowing they were no longer just recording a show, but history. Even the fire officers, stiff and uncertain minutes earlier, leaned back in their chairs, recognizing that the room was no longer theirs to command. Elvis raised the microphone again, ready to carry them further, but the moment had already crystallized. This was the pivot, the instant when panic bowed to trust, when authority shifted from officials and managers to the single man who refused to yield. The alarm still screamed, but no one was moving toward the doors anymore. They were looking only at him, and in that gaze, thousands of eyes locked on a single figure. The truth of the night revealed itself. Chaos had been turned into unity, fear into faith, by nothing more than the presence and voice of one man. The siren still shrieked overhead, merciless in its rhythm, but it no longer ruled the room. The crowd had shifted. The fear that once made them restless now simmered into anticipation, waiting for Elvis to move, to speak, to decide what came next. He stood in the light, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling like a man preparing for battle. And then, without warning, he began to sing. Not the scheduled song, not the rehearsed set list, but something deeper, something chosen in that very second. His voice carried the first words of "If I Can Dream," raw and unaccompanied at first, the kind of song born from conviction rather than performance. The audience gasped. That song had always been tied to hope, to longing for something greater than fear and suspicion. Hearing it now, against the shriek of the alarm, was like watching a torch ignite in darkness. The band scrambled at first, uncertain. The pianist hesitated. The brass section glanced nervously at one another, but Elvis's voice left no room for doubt. Within seconds, they found their places, sliding into the melody with cautious strength. The music rose like a tide, meeting his words, supporting them, expanding them until they filled every corner of the hall. The siren wailed, but it was already losing ground. His voice soared above it, the orchestra swelling behind him, the two sounds colliding until the machine became no more than a nuisance beneath the weight of human sound. The audience responded instinctively. Some began to sing along, voices trembling but resolute. Others clapped softly in rhythm, as if to anchor themselves to him. By the second verse, entire rows were singing, their faces tilted upward, tears streaking cheeks, jaws set with determination. What had begun as panic was transforming into a chorus. Thousands of strangers welded together by one song. Between the lines, Elvis broke tradition. Instead of pushing directly into the next lyric, he spoke, his words riding on the melody like fragments of a sermon. "Don't let fear scatter you," he called out, sweat glistening under the lights. "Don't let this siren tell you what to feel. We are stronger than this noise. We are stronger than shadows." The crowd answered with cheers, then joined him again in the chorus. The alarm still screamed, but fewer heads turned toward the ceiling now. Eyes were locked on him, as though the shrill cry overhead was nothing more than a test of endurance. In the front row, a woman in her 60s gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had been ready to run minutes earlier, but now tears streamed freely as she mouthed the words with him. A young man in a cheap jacket, perhaps a tourist who had saved for years to afford the ticket, shouted the lyrics with a voice cracked by emotion. Even the firemen, stiff in their seats, shifted uncomfortably, because they too felt the pull, the undeniable truth of the moment. The song grew louder, fuller. By the time Elvis reached the bridge, we're lost in a cloud with too much rain. The crowd erupted. The alarm's pitch seemed weaker now, as though the machine itself couldn't compete with the human will rising against it. Elvis tilted his head back, pouring everything into the climax. His voice trembling not with fear, but with force. Between lines, he raised his free hand high, palm open, urging the audience to sing with him. And they did. Thousands of voices crashing together, imperfect but powerful. The siren was still there, but in their ears it no longer mattered. The journalists scribbled furiously, some with trembling hands. They had come expecting a scandal, maybe tragedy. Instead, they found themselves caught in the swell, witnesses to something they would never fully capture on paper. Elvis's words between verses deepened the transformation. Look around you. Strangers, friends, rich or poor, it doesn't matter. Right now, we are one. And no alarm, no fear, no shadow can take that from us. The audience roared in response, then returned to the song with renewed strength. The Hilton showroom, once on the verge of chaos, now pulsed like a cathedral, not of marble or stained glass, but of sweat, sound, and human resilience. By the time the song reached its final refrain, the hall was shaking, not from panic, but from voices united. Even those who didn't know the lyrics hummed along, refusing to stay silent. The fire alarm had been stripped of its power. It was no longer a warning of doom, but merely the background to a moment of defiance. Elvis ended with a sustained note, long and aching, his body leaning forward as though giving every last ounce of breath. The band crashed behind him, cymbals shivering, brass blaring, and when the final chord landed, the audience exploded, their applause a wall of sound that for the first time truly drowned out the alarm. He stood there, sweating, trembling, chest heaving, but unbroken. The fire they had feared was nowhere to be found. The fire was in them now, in their hearts, in their voices, in the unity they had created together. When the last note of If I Can Dream fell away, the Hilton showroom was consumed by silence. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the alarm stopped. The shrill, mechanical cry that had haunted the night cut off mid-pulse, leaving only the echo of applause still ringing in the ears of the crowd. The sudden absence of noise was so sharp, it felt like the entire room had been plunged underwater. Elvis stood motionless in the spotlight. His chest rose and fell heavily, sweat gleaming on his forehead, the white fabric of his jumpsuit damp with effort. His hands trembled faintly at his sides, but his face was calm, resolute, as though he had carried not only the weight of the performance, but of every soul in that hall. The audience sat frozen in their seats, hundreds of eyes locked on him. Some still clutched at one another's arms, unable to let go after the long minutes of fear. A woman dabbed her cheeks with a crushed tissue, smearing mascara. A man in a tailored suit wiped his brow, his diamond ring glinting under the chandelier light. Even the reporters, their pens hovering above paper, seemed reluctant to break the silence. Then, slowly, the applause began. A single pair of hands clapping, then another, until the entire room surged to its feet. The ovation was not polite or practiced. It was primal, a roar of gratitude, relief, and awe. The sound was deafening, yet different from the chaos earlier. It was united, controlled, born of admiration rather than panic. People shouted his name, some with tears streaming, others with voices cracking. For once, it wasn't just fandom. It was reverence. Elvis lowered his gaze, almost humbled by the sight. He held the microphone close, waiting for the applause to crest and soften just enough for his voice to reach them. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the same gravity as the song that had just ended. "You've all heard it tonight," he began, his drawl steady, deliberate. "We ran from a fire that wasn't there. We listened to a machine, to whispers, to fear, and it almost tore us apart. The crowd stilled, their cheers tapering into silence again. He let the pause linger, ensuring every ear was open, every heart leaning in. But the real fire, he continued, raising his hand slowly, the real fire is here. He touched his chest with his open palm, pressing it firmly. It's in us, in our hearts, and if that fire keeps burning, we're alive. No alarm, no shadow, no fear can put it out. His words rippled through the room. Some gasped, others nodded. Many simply stood with tears glinting in their eyes. For them, it wasn't just a singer giving comfort. It was a truth, spoken plainly at the end of a night where everything had seemed to fall apart. Elvis let his hand drop, the microphone still steady in his grip. "Don't be afraid of the flames that aren't there," he said softly. "Be afraid of forgetting the ones that are. The fire inside, that's what keeps us standing." The silence that followed was unlike anything the Hilton had ever heard. Even the clink of glasses at the bar stopped. Even the restless shuffling of chairs froze. For a heartbeat, it felt like time had folded in on itself. And then, the room erupted. A standing ovation so loud it rattled the chandeliers, so fierce it echoed down the hallways of the casino. People who had nearly trampled each other minutes earlier now embraced. Strangers holding strangers, united in the echo of those words. The fire officials, who had sat stiff and skeptical all night, rose to their feet, hats in hand, applauding with a sincerity they had not expected to feel. The journalists, shaken by what they had witnessed, scribbled furiously, though many knew they could never truly capture the electricity of the moment on paper. The casino managers, red-faced and sweating, were silent now, realizing that the man they had feared would ruin them had instead created something unforgettable. Elvis, exhausted yet unbowed, gave a small bow. Not theatrical, not exaggerated, simply a gesture of respect to the crowd that had trusted him when everything told them not to. His eyes glimmered as he looked out across the sea of faces, and for a moment he seemed less like a performer and more like a preacher who had just delivered a sermon the congregation didn't know they needed. That night would be told and retold. In newspapers the next morning, headlines would veer away from panic and scandal. They would speak instead of "The night Elvis stilled the fire alarm," "The king who calmed the storm," "When Presley sang louder than fear." But no words could ever match the lived memory of those who were there, the moment when thousands of people, trembling under the weight of fear, were pulled back to themselves by a single voice. Elvis stepped back from the microphone, the spotlight still holding him in its glow. For one last time, he lifted his hand in a gentle wave. The ovation swelled once more, not ending, not fading, but rising higher, as though no one wanted the night to end. And in that final wave, in those last words, the legend was sealed. Not because of the songs, not because of the glamour, but because in a moment of chaos he had given them fire. Not in smoke and flame, but in their hearts.